Imagine standing in front of your entire class, clutching the notebook you've poured your heart into, only to hear your teacher laugh at your dream while everyone else follows. That's exactly what happened to Maya. What began as a nervous school presentation quickly turned into public humiliation. But instead of letting the laughter break her, she carried it with her, fueling something no one expected. This is the story of how one moment of ridicule became the spark for a journey that would change everything. Would you have given up or pushed forward? Before we continue with this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel as we have a special story that'll be released soon. Maya stood at the front of the classroom, her palms slick with sweat despite the air conditioner humming faintly above. The sound of shuffling papers and the low murmur of classmates settling into their seats seemed louder than usual, each cough and laugh echoing in her head like a distraction she could not ignore. She clutched her notebook to her chest for a moment longer than necessary, eyes fixed on the chalkboard as if it could somehow shield her from the 30 pairs of eyes staring expectantly. The teacher, sitting at his desk with an expression of mild impatience, tapped his pen against a stack of ungraded assignments. She had practiced this moment for weeks. At night, when the rest of the house fell into silence, she rehearsed in front of her cracked bedroom mirror. She had written her speech out 3 different times, cut it down, and revised again until the words felt sharp and clear, yet standing. There now, her heart hammered in her ears, threatening to drown out everything she had prepared. Taking a breath, she opened the notebook and smoothed the corner of the page. She began, her voice softer than she meant it to be. A ripple of whispering passed through the room. Someone chuckled in the back. Maya forced herself not to glance at them, keeping her eyes on the spot where the wall met the ceiling. If she looked at faces too soon, she knew her courage would collapse. "My idea," she said, pausing to steady her voice, "is for a business that connects local craftspeople with customers directly, without big stores taking most of the profit." The words came faster now, tumbling over each other as she warmed to the subject. "There are so many talented people in our community, people who make jewelry, sew clothes, or build furniture, but most don't have a way to reach buyers outside of weekend markets. I want to create an online platform where they can post their work, set their own prices, and keep almost everything they earn." She dared a glance at the class. Some looked bored, others mildly curious. In the second row, a girl rested her, chin on her hand, tapping her pen against her notebook. In the back, 2 boys whispered in stifled laughter. Maya pressed forward, trying not to let it rattle her. It would be simple to start. She continued, flipping the page where she had drawn diagrams in pencil. The website would allow for small listings. At first, it could focus on just our town, but over time it could expand. Customers could buy directly from the makers, and we could even include a feature for custom orders. She looked down at her notes, her finger tracing the numbers she had worked so hard to calculate. "I've already sketched out the basic budget. With a few $100s, I could build the first version myself. I know it sounds small compared to big companies, but even if it helps 10 people sell their work, that's 10 families making more money than before." She turned to the final page, her nerves loosening just enough to allow a hint of pride into her voice. "I believe that businesses don't always have to be about making the most profit for one person. It can be about lifting other people up too. This idea is about fairness, and it's about opportunity." For a moment, the classroom was quiet. Ache closed her notebook slowly, her fingers trembling, and waited for some kind of response. She expected maybe a few nods, a question or two, even polite applause. What she really hoped for, more than anything, was a flicker of encouragement, a sign that someone saw the potential. She had poured into those words, her chest rose and fell as she searched the faces before her. A few students avoided her eyes. One boy stifled a yawn. She felt her heartbeat quicken again, the silence stretching unbearably long. She looked toward her teacher, the man whose opinion mattered more than all the rest combined. If he approved, maybe the others would too. If he simply acknowledged that her idea had merit, perhaps the sting of nervousness would fade into something closer to pride. He leaned back in his chair, his pen tapping once more against the stack of papers. His lips curled, but not into the kind of smile she had imagined during all those late-night rehearsals. Maya stood frozen, notebook clutched to her chest again, unsure whether she had just stepped into the first step of her dream, or the moment that might shatter it entirely. The silence in the classroom stretched so long that Maya almost convinced herself it was a good sign that perhaps her teacher was weighing her words, considering the effort she had put into her idea. But then the sound of his chuckle broke through the stillness. Low at first, then louder, filling the space with a sharp edge that made her stomach twist. She felt her face grow hot as the teacher leaned forward in his chair, shaking his head. Slowly, the corners of his mouth drawn into a smirk. "An online marketplace?" he said, his tone coated with disbelief. "Maya, do you have any idea how many people already do that? Amazon, eBay, Etsy, entire corporations with billions of dollars and armies of programmers, and you think you're going to compete with them?" With a notebook and a dream, the class erupted into laughter. It wasn't just a few snickers in the back row anymore. It was a chorus of chuckles. Giggles and whispered remarks passed between desks. Maya gripped her notebook tighter, pressing it against her chest as if it might shield her from the sting of every sound. Her knees threatened to give way beneath her. She stared hard at the tiled floor, willing the laughter to fade. Her teacher didn't stop there, stood up and walked toward the chalkboard, pacing a few steps with exaggerated slowness. "You see, class," he continued, gesturing with his pen like a conductor orchestrating ridicule, "this is exactly why we need to think realistically. Dreams are fine, but when they're not grounded in reality, they turn into wasted effort. Maya wants to take on Amazon." He turned, fixing his gaze on her again. "Tell me, do you think you can outspend them, out-advertise them, out-deliver them?" She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Every possible response she had rehearsed seemed small and laughable in the face of his sneering tone. The class laughed again, louder now, emboldened by his lead. A boy in the back mimed typing on a keyboard, whispering something about Maya.com. Sending another ripple of laughter across the room, the humiliation was suffocating. Her ears burned. She wished for the ground to swallow her whole, to disappear into the cracks between the tiles where no one could see her. Yet at the same time, something inside her shifted. Beneath the sting of shame, beneath the crushing weight of being mocked by the very authority she had hoped to impress, a spark of anger began to burn. Her teacher returned to his desk, still shaking his head. "This is why most businesses fail," he said, addressing the class as though she were invisible. "They're built on naive ideas without any grasp of the real world. Better to focus on a stable career, something achievable, instead of chasing impossible fantasies." Maya couldn't breathe. Her throat ached with words she couldn't say. She lowered her eyes to her notebook, the pages now feeling like evidence against her rather than proof of her determination. Around her, the laughter was dying down, replaced by murmurs of amusement and the scratch of pens across paper as some classmates wrote down their own ideas. The teacher's dismissal of hers hung in the air like a verdict, final and merciless. When she finally made her way back to her seat, her legs felt wooden. She lowered herself slowly into the chair, avoiding every glance that turned her way. A girl behind her whispered something she couldn't make out, followed by more stifled laughter. She clenched her notebook in her lap, staring at its worn cover, the pencil diagrams and scribbled budgets hidden inside. Only hours ago, those pages had felt like the start of something extraordinary. Now they seemed like nothing more than a child's fantasy ridiculed into dust by the very person meant to nurture ambition. And yet, as she sat there in silence, the spark inside her refused to die. It burned hotter with every insult replaying in her head. His words stung, yes, but they also etched themselves into her memory. If he thought her idea was foolish, if he thought she was incapable, then she would carry those words with her, not as a reason to stop, but as a reason to keep going. The laughter around her cut deep. But somewhere in the pain, she felt the faintest edge of resolve forming. She did not know how she would prove him wrong, or when. All she knew was that one day she would. When the bell rang, Maya gathered her things as quickly as she could, hoping to slip out unnoticed. The laughter from her presentation still clung to the air like smoke, impossible to escape. She pressed her notebook tight against her chest, head down, and threaded her way toward the door. But whispers trailed after her, sharp and deliberate, meant to be heard. "Did you hear her?" Competing with Amazon? Maybe she'll start by selling cookies from her locker. She really thought that was going to impress anyone. The voices blended with the scrape of chairs and the shuffle of footsteps, but each word felt like a stone hurled at her back. Maya's shoulders stiffened. She didn't turn around. She told herself that if she walked quickly enough, if she kept her eyes on the hallway ahead, she could outpace the sound. In the corridor, clusters of students leaned against lockers, their conversations rising and falling like waves. As she passed, she felt their eyes on her, curious, amused, some even pitying. A boy near the water fountain nudged his friend, smirking. "Hey, Maya, when's the grand opening of your store? Need investors?" His friend laughed, and Maya tightened her grip on her books, quickening her pace. The sting wasn't just in the mockery, but in the silence from those she once thought of as friends. Two girls she usually walked with after class turned away when she approached, their laughter dying abruptly as if her presence reminded them of something too embarrassing to be seen with. One muttered a weak sorry without meeting her eyes before slipping into the restroom. The other stared at her phone, pretending to type, pretending not to notice her at all. It was a different kind of pain, less sharp than the teacher's words, but heavier somehow. To be mocked by strangers was one thing, to be avoided by those she trusted was another. The loneliness pressed down on her chest until it was hard to breathe. She bit the inside of her cheek, holding back the tears threatening to rise. She would not cry in the hallway. She would not give them that, at her locker. She spun the combination with trembling fingers, every click of the dial echoing in her head like a countdown to collapse. She stuffed her books inside with more force than necessary, the slam of the locker door a brittle attempt at control. Her reflection in the metal blurred, distorted, showed wide eyes and flushed cheeks, a face caught between shame and defiance. The rest of the day dragged on, each class a blur of muffled laughter and sidelong glances. She took notes mechanically, her pen moving across the paper without absorbing the words on the board. What she did notice always was the silence that followed her when she entered a room, the whispers that started again when she left. By the time she got home, the weight of it had settled deep inside her. She shut her bedroom door softly, dropped her bag on the floor, and sank onto her bed. For a few moments, she let herself feel it, the humiliation, the loneliness, the sting of betrayal. Tears slipped free, despite her best efforts, soaking the fabric of her pillow. But even as they fell, she reached for her notebook. The familiar weight of it in her hands steadied her breathing. She opened to a blank page, smoothing it with the side of her palm. The margins of earlier pages were already filled with doodles and lists, but this one felt different. This one wasn't for a class assignment or for the approval of a teacher. This page would be hers alone. She picked up her pencil and began to sketch. A rough outline of the website's homepage. A simple logo idea in the corner. Words like direct, fair, and community scribbled across the top. Lines weren't neat, and the ideas weren't polished, but they were Herson-touched by ridicule, unshaken by laughter. Every stroke of the pencil dulled the echoes of the day just a little more. The voices in the hallway faded, replaced by the quiet scratching of graphite on paper. The sting of being avoided by friends softened, replaced by the fragile hope that maybe she didn't need their approval after all. By the time the page was filled, Maya leaned back against the wall, her cheeks still damp but her eyes steadier. The humiliation of the classroom and the whispers in the hall were wounds she couldn't yet close. But in the quiet of her room, with her notebook in her lap, she began to realize something that steadied her heart. They could laugh, they could whisper, they could turn away. She would keep drawing, keep writing, keep planning. Because deep down, the spark hadn't died, it was only just beginning to glow. The kitchen was warm with the smell of garlic and onions sizzling in a pan, the familiar rhythm of her mother's cooking filling the small house. Maya dropped her bag by the door more heavily than she intended. And her mother glanced up from the stove, immediately sensing something in the slump of her daughter's shoulders. Her younger brother sat at the table, hunched over his math homework, while her father leaned back in his chair, reading the day's newspaper with a mug of tea steaming beside him. It was an ordinary evening, but Maya felt anything but ordinary as she slid into a chair. Her notebook clutched tightly against her chest like a fragile secret, Her mother turned down the flame and set the wooden spoon aside. "Long day?" Ch asked gently, though her eyes were sharp, already scanning Maya's face for the answer. Maya hesitated. She wanted to shrug it off, to claim she was just tired, but the weight of the day pressed too heavily on her chest. If she didn't speak, it would swallow her whole. She opened the notebook, stared at the pages that had once made her proud, and felt her throat tighten. "They laughed at me," she whispered finally. The words came out hoarse, barely audible above the hiss of the pan. Her father lowered the newspaper slowly, his brow furrowing. Her brother looked up from his work, confused, pencil frozen mid-equation. Maya took a shaky breath, the memory of the classroom rising fresh again. "I gave my presentation today, about my business idea. I thought maybe it would go well, maybe someone would believe in it. But Mr. Parker," she trailed off, her lip trembling. "He mocked me, said I was naive, said I could never compete with big companies. And the class, they all laughed too. Even my friends wouldn't walk with me afterward. They just—" She shook her head, unable to finish. Her mother wiped her hands on a towel and moved to sit beside her, pulling her close. She murmured, brushing damp hair away from her daughter's face. "I'm sorry they made you feel that way." Her father leaned forward, elbows resting on the table, eyes steady on hers. "So what?" he said, his tone firm but not unkind. "Let them laugh. Let him mock. If your idea matters to you, then it matters. That's all the approval you need." Maya blinked at him, startled. "But everyone thinks it's stupid. Everyone." "In your classroom," he corrected. "A classroom isn't the world. Most people laugh at things they don't understand. Some laugh because they can't imagine themselves ever doing what you just did, standing up there, sharing something. That came from your heart. That takes courage, and they don't see it because they don't have it." Her brother, still clutching his pencil, nodded earnestly. "I think it's cool," he said. "Like people make stuff all the time, but don't know where to sell. If you made a website, I bet people would use it. I'd even help if you wanted." Her mother smiled at that, stroking Maya's back. "Your teacher's job is to prepare you for the world, but sometimes they forget that the world changes. Big companies didn't start big. They started with someone's small idea, someone who refused to give up when others laughed." Maya's eyes stung, though this time, not with humiliation, but with something closer to relief. The heaviness she had carried since leaving school eased a little as she listened. She had expected pity, perhaps even for her family to tell her, to be practical, to forget about it, and focus on safer dreams. But instead, each word from them was a thread pulling her back together, reminding her that one voice mocking her didn't define her worth. Her father leaned back again, a faint smile tugging at the edge of his mouth. "You know what I think? Mr. Parker gave you a gift. He showed you what resistance feels like. If you can push through this, if you can keep working even when people laugh, then nothing will stop you later. Success isn't about applause, it's about persistence." Her mother stood, returned to the stove, and stirred the pan with renewed energy. "So you keep drawing in that notebook of yours. Keep building your idea. One day you'll show them. Not out of spite, but because the world needs people who believe in something, even when no one else does." Maya sat quietly, letting their words sink in, the warmth of the kitchen settling into her chest. She opened her notebook again, turning to the page she had filled the night before with sketches and scribbles. For the first time all day, she didn't see it as childish or foolish. She saw it as a beginning. Her family wasn't laughing. They were leaning closer, waiting to see what she would do next. She picked up her pencil and drew a line across the page, firm and steady. She didn't know yet how she would make it work, but she knew she wasn't done. Not by a long shot. As her family moved around her, her brother humming softly, her father folding his newspaper, her mother humming over the stove, Maya felt a seed take root deep inside her, small but unshakable. It was determination. It was hers. Maya woke the next morning with the echoes of her father's words still fresh in her mind. The sting of the classroom had not disappeared, but it no longer felt like a wound. It was more like a scar that reminded her what she wanted to fight against. She sat at her desk after breakfast, the notebook open in front of her, staring at the sketches she had drawn. The idea was simple enough: a platform where local makers could sell their creations directly to customers. The problem was, she had no money, no equipment beyond an aging laptop, and very little technical knowledge of building websites. Yet she refused to let that stop her. If she could not build the entire platform right away, she would start small, proving her idea step by step until it became undeniable. Her first attempt was modest. She borrowed her mother's old baking pans and spent an afternoon in the kitchen making small batches of cookies. Using recipes she had memorized from her grandmother, she wrapped them in plastic bags and attached handwritten labels with a simple name she had scribbled the night before, made by Maya. She brought them to her neighbors' doors, explaining she was trying something new and asking if they might want to try them. Some smiled and bought a bag out of kindness. Others politely declined. A few children from the street snatched the cookies eagerly, running off with crumbs trailing behind them. It wasn't much, but when she counted the few crumpled bills in her pocket at the end of the day, she felt a thrill of possibility. The next week, she shifted her focus. Baking had been a test, but it wasn't what she wanted to build her idea on. Instead, she borrowed books from the library on website design and spent late nights hunched over the glowing screen of her laptop, learning basic coding, HTML, CSS, tutorials, scribbled on loose sheets of paper. It was overwhelming at first. The language foreign, the structure confusing, but each small breakthrough lit a spark of excitement. The first time she managed to make a page display her own text instead of generic template words, she nearly woke her brother with her laugh of disbelief. Slowly, she pieced together a rough version of her idea, a simple page with mock listings she had created. She added photographs of her mother's hand-stitched tablecloth and her neighbor's carved wooden spoon, pretending they were items for sale. She wasn't ready to make it public, but seeing the page take shape filled her with a sense of control she hadn't felt in weeks. Every line of code, every imperfect image, was proof she was moving forward. When she showed it to her brother one evening, he whistled softly. "It looks real," he said, scrolling through the page with wide eyes, "like something you'd actually see online." "It's not finished," Maya admitted, biting her lip. "And it's not professional, but it's something." "It's more than something," he said firmly. "It's the start."
Alex.
Encouraged, Maya began reaching out to a few neighbors she trusted, asking if she could photograph the things they made to test the website further. One woman who sewed patchwork bags agreed, letting Maya take pictures in her living room. A retired carpenter down the street, skeptical at first, finally relented when Maya explained she wasn't charging him anything, she just wanted to see how his work might look on the site. She borrowed her father's old digital camera, the battery barely holding charge, and snapped photo after photo, awkward but determined. At night, she uploaded the images to her laptop and placed them carefully on the mock site. Each time she refreshed the page and saw the items lined up: a bag, a spoon, a cloth that felt more real, like her dream had stepped a fraction closer into existence. She imagined customers scrolling through, choosing what they loved, sending money directly to the people who made these things. It wasn't just about profit, it was about dignity, about giving her community a way to be seen. Of course, setbacks came quickly. Her laptop crashed more than once, erasing hours of progress. The camera's battery died mid-shoot, leaving her frustrated and waiting until it recharged. Some neighbors laughed gently when she explained what she was doing, telling her it was a sweet hobby but nothing more.
How?
Each obstacle stung, but none stopped her. She kept her notebook close, jotting down lessons from every failure, refining her sketches, writing reminders to herself in bold letters: keep going, one step at a time. One evening, long after her parents had gone to bed, she sat cross-legged on her floor with papers scattered around her and her laptop glowing dimly. She stared at the mock site she had built, rough edges and all, and felt something stir inside her. This wasn't yet the platform she had imagined when she stood in front of her class, but it was proof she could take an idea, however small, and make it real with nothing more than persistence and borrowed tools. Her classmates could laugh, her teacher could dismiss her. But here in the quiet of her room, Maya knew she had taken the first steps towards something bigger than their opinions. She whispered the words aloud, as if anchoring them to her own heart. This is just the beginning. The first weeks after Maya began her experiments were filled with a mix of nervous excitement and growing disappointment. The website she had pieced together was rough, clunky, and difficult to navigate. She had hoped the neighbors whose work she had uploaded might share it with friends, spreading the word. But when she checked her page each morning, the number of visits was the same, almost none. The cookies she baked sold quickly the first time, but the next attempt left her with stacks of unsold bags sitting on the kitchen counter. She tried bringing them to school discreetly, hoping classmates might buy them during breaks. But most walked past without a glance, and a few laughed, asking if this was her big business idea. At home, she hid her frustration behind quiet determination. She stayed up late at her desk, erasing and rewriting her plans in the notebook until the paper wore thin. The first set of photos she had taken looked dull compared to real online. Stores? She didn't have proper lighting or editing skills, so the items appeared flat, unappealing. When she tried to list them with made-up prices just to test the process, even she felt unconvinced that anyone would click buy. Each attempt revealed another layer of how unprepared she was, how far her dreams stood from reality, but Maya refused to let the failures close in on her. Instead, she treated them like lessons. She noted that her cookies needed better packaging, not just plastic bags. She scribbled ideas for labels, imagining brighter designs that might catch attention. She recognized her website needed clearer images. So she asked her brother to help hold lamps around the kitchen while she photographed items again, experimenting with shadows and angles. The results weren't perfect, but they were better. And she reminded herself that improvement, however small, was still progress. The hardest part was the lack of support. Neighbors who had once smiled politely now shrugged when she asked if they wanted to participate. Few suggested she'd focus on school instead of wasting time. Her teacher's voice still echoed in her mind, reminding her she was chasing something impossible. Even her classmates, who didn't go out of their way to mock her anymore, simply ignored her efforts, as if she no longer existed in their world. That quiet dismissal cut more deeply than laughter. On weekends, Maya walked to the small market on the edge of town, carrying a cardboard box filled with cookies, hand-sewn bracelets she had made herself, and a few wood carvings borrowed with permission from her neighbor. She set up a tiny table near the entrance, her notebook open at the corner with handmade. Direct from the maker scrawled in her handwriting. Some people stopped and smiled, asking a few questions, but most hurried past. By noon, her legs ached from standing, her voice sore from repeating the same hopeful pitch. And still her box was half full. She went home that evening with only a handful of coins, her pockets heavy with failure. She set the box down in her room, closed the door, and sank onto the floor. For the first time in weeks, she let herself cry, the tears spilling quietly onto the rough carpet. But even then, between sobs, her hand reached for her pencil. She flipped to a fresh page in her notebook and began writing. What went wrong today? She listed every mistake she could think of: presentation, location, timing. Then on the opposite side of the page, she wrote, what to try next time. The next morning, she went back to work. She redesigned her signs, brighter and bolder. Adjusted her prices, realizing she had asked too much for untested goods. She searched the library for books, not just on coding, but on marketing, photography, and small business management. Each failure became fuel, each setback a lesson scribbled into the margins of her growing pile of notes. It was exhausting. Some nights she fell asleep at her desk, head pressed against open pages, pencil still in her hand. Her parents found her, like that more than once, shaking their heads with a mix of worry and pride. But Maya didn't stop.
Oh, the failure stung.
But giving up would have stung worse. Each attempt chipped away at her fear, sharpening her resolve. When she looked at her reflection in the mirror one late night, dark circles under her eyes, she no longer saw the timid girl who had stood trembling at the front of her classroom. She saw someone scarred by setbacks, but not defeated. Someone who had begun to understand that success wasn't built on applause, but on persistence. And with that thought, she bent over her notebook once more, sketching the next plan, ready to face failure again if it meant moving one step closer to the future she imagined. The days settled into a rhythm that felt unlike anything Maya had lived before. At school, she moved through the halls quietly, her head bent over her books, blending into the background. She did her assignments, answered when called on, and spoke little else. Her classmates had moved on from the sting of mocking her presentation, their attention drifting to gossip, sports, and parties. To them, she was simply another face in the crowd, unremarkable and easy to ignore. But at night, when the world turned dim and her small bedroom filled with the sound of tapping keys and the scratch of her pencil, Maya came alive. She waited until the house was silent before she spread her notebooks across her desk. The pages, filled with diagrams, lists, and scribbled reminders. Her old laptop hummed weakly, the fan rattling whenever she asked too much of it, but it became her window to a larger world.
Ow.
Tutorials on coding played faintly through her headphones. On business strategy lit up the screen in black text on white background. Her hands moved constantly typing, writing, sketching, building piece by piece what no one else could see. Outside her window, the neighborhood sank into sleep. Porch lights blinked off one by one. Cars stopped passing. A dog barked in the distance and then fell silent. The quiet of those hours steadied her, giving her space to think without interruption. She felt as though the night itself guarded her secrets, holding back the doubts of the day so she could work freely. It was during these hours that she refined her website again and again. She tore apart the structure, rebuilding it after each discovery. She adjusted colors, learned how to align text properly, experimented with image placement, until the mock listings looked like something real. The site was still far from perfect, but every small improvement felt monumental. A victory no one else could understand. Her hands often cramped from writing, but she refused to stop. She tracked every expense down to the cent ingredients for cookies, costs of printer ink for flyers, the possibility of buying a second-hand camera when she could save enough. On other pages, she wrote down every lesson from her failed attempts. Wrong location, unclear signs, prices too high. The notebook into a record of mistakes and possibilities, a blueprint of her growth. Sometimes fatigue pressed down so heavily she nearly gave in. She would glance at the clock and see that it was past 1 a.m, her body aching for rest. But then she remembered the sound of her teacher's laughter, the way her classmates had looked at her, and she pushed herself to finish one more line of code, one more sketch, one more idea. She knew no one else would do this for her. If she wanted the dream to live, she had to keep feeding it, even if it meant stealing time from her own sleep. Meanwhile, life around her carried on in a different rhythm. She overheard classmates planning, parties laughing about who would bring snacks, who was dating whom. On Monday mornings, the hallways buzzed with stories of weekend adventures, the kind of carefree moments she had no part in. There were times she longed for that simplicity, to just be a normal teenager who didn't carry this heavy determination. But when she weighed the choice, she always came back to her desk. She knew what she wanted, mattered more than a fleeting laugh at a party. Her parents noticed the change. Her mother sometimes knocked softly at her door around midnight, urging her to sleep, reminding her that her health mattered too. Amaya would nod, promise to rest soon, then return to her work the moment the door closed. Her father left a lamp on her desk one evening, brighter and sturdier than the one she had been using. He didn't say much, just ruffled her hair and muttered, "For the late nights." She smiled at the gesture, understanding that he saw what she was doing even without asking questions. There were nights when progress seemed invisible, when the hours bled together without producing anything tangible. On those nights she would close her eyes, breathe deeply, and remind herself that persistence itself was a form of progress. Not every step had to be visible to matter. Some nights were for breakthroughs. Others were for building the quiet discipline that would carry her further than excitement alone. By the time dawn crept through her window, she often had ink smudges on her fingers and aching eyes from staring at the glowing screen. She would close her notebook, shut her laptop, and slip into bed for a few hours of restless sleep before school. Her classmates would see her yawning, assume she had wasted the night scrolling through her phone. While they laughed and rested, she was shaping something out of nothing, laying the groundwork for a dream that refused to die. Maya carried the weight of exhaustion during the day. Under it burned a quiet pride. She alone knew the hours she had sacrificed, the effort she had poured into her work. Each night of burning the midnight oil was an act of defiance, declaration that she would not be silenced by mockery or limited by resources. While others drifted through their days untouched, Maya lived with purpose, her secret work binding her more tightly to the future. She was determined to create. The first signs of change came so quietly that Maya almost didn't notice. It had been months of long nights and early mornings, of pouring herself into work that seemed invisible to the rest of the world. Her website still looked simple compared to polished companies, and her flyers taped around the market and near bus stops were often peeled down or ignored. Yet one Saturday morning, as she set up her modest table at the market with cookies and a few hand-sewn items from neighbors, a woman she had never seen before approached with a deliberate step. "Been looking for you," the woman said, picking up a small patchwork bag. Her eyes were bright, her voice steady. "My friend bought one of these last week. She said she found you through your website. Do you have more like it?" Maya blinked in surprise, her fingers tightening on the edge of the table. She had heard so many polite dismissals, seen so many people glance and walk past, that the directness of the question startled her. "Yes," she said quickly, pulling another bag from beneath the table. "Different colors, if you'd like." The woman bought two without hesitation. She paid in cash, tucked the bags under her arm, and promised to return. As she walked away, Maya's chest swelled with something she hadn't felt in months: validation. Someone had come looking for her, not out of pity, not because they were family or friends, because they wanted what she offered. That single moment carried her through the week, but it was only the beginning. A few days later, her brother burst into her room, waving his phone in the air. "Maya, look at this," he shouted, almost tripping over the scattered notebooks on her floor. She glanced up from her laptop, bleary-eyed from coding. On his screen was a social media post from a local influencer, a young woman who often shared about small businesses in their town. She had posted a picture of one of Maya's cookies, wrapped in its handmade label, with a caption, "Best surprise treat I've had in weeks. Found this at the market. Homemade, delicious, and worth every cent." Maya's hands trembled as she took the phone. The post already had hundreds of likes and dozens of comments, people asking where to buy them, tagging their friends. Her name, her little brand, was being spoken by strangers. She had no idea how the influencer had found her table, but it didn't matter. The spark had been lit. The following Saturday, her market stall drew a small but steady stream of customers. Some asked shyly if she was the girl from the post. Others tried her cookies and bought extra to share with friends. One woman asked about the website, jotting down the address so she could check it later. For the first time, Maya found herself scrambling to keep up, her hands moving quickly to bag cookies and answer questions. The coins and bills collected in her tin box piled higher than they ever had before. That evening, when she returned home, she emptied the box on her bed and stared at the small mountain of cash. It wasn't much by the standards of big companies, but to her it was proof. Proof that she could sell. Proof that her idea wasn't just a fantasy scribbled in a notebook. She spread the money out and counted it twice, then pulled her notebook closer and began writing again. Invest in better packaging. Make more batches. Update photos on site. Each step forward made her hungrier for the next. She used the money to buy sturdier paper for labels, borrowing her mother's colored markers to create designs that stood out more. She researched affordable boxes and bags online, calculating how many she could afford. She returned to her website, adding the influencer's photo as a testimonial with permission, polishing the look until it appeared just a little more professional. The growth was fragile, still uncertain, but it was growth nonetheless. At night, Maya stared at the faint glow of her laptop screen and felt her determination solidify. The ridicule from her classroom was still a memory she carried, but it no longer pressed down on her the way it once had. She had something stronger to hold on to, The sound of customers asking for her by name, the sight of strangers carrying her products. The image of her notebook filling with plans that were no longer just dreams. As the weeks passed, word spread slowly but surely. A teacher from another school bought cookies for her staff. Neighbor asked if she could list her knitted scarves on the site. Small orders trickled in, each one a tiny victory. It wasn't a flood of success, but it was enough to show Maya that what she was building mattered. The spark had caught, and for the first time she could see the possibility of a flame. Late one night, she leaned back in her chair, exhausted but smiling. She looked at the wall where she had taped scraps of paper with her goals written in hurried handwriting. 1 customer, 10 customers, 100. For the first time, the first. 2 goals had check marks beside them. She picked up her pencil, wrote the word 1,000, and drew a small empty box beside it. It didn't scare her anymore. It felt like a promise. The market stalls bustled with life on Saturday morning, the smell of roasted corn and fried dough mixing with the chatter of families walking past. Maya set up her table in her usual corner, arranging cookies in neat rows, and propping up the bags she had carefully labeled the night before. Her brother had helped her carry the boxes, teasing her gently about how serious she looked as she lined everything just right. She brushed him off with a smile, though inside, her nerves twisted as they always did. Even with the recent attention, she never knew if people would actually come. This time, they did. A woman pushing a stroller stopped, smiling warmly. "You're Maya, right? My friend bought from you last week and wouldn't stop talking about?" It said I had to try. She picked up a bag of cookies and handed Maya a few bills without hesitation. Her child tugged at her sleeve, pointing at the table, and she added another bag to her purchase. Moments later, a pair of teenagers approached, phones in hand. One of them laughed, showing her screen to the other. "This is the girl from the post I was telling you about," she said. "Look, she's right here." They bought a pack each, snapping a picture before walking away. Maya stood frozen for a second, hardly believing strangers were treating her little stall like it mattered. By noon, the small tin where she kept her money was nearly full. People lingered to ask about her idea, and a few even asked if they could list their own products on her website. She scribbled down names and numbers in her notebook, her hands shaking with excitement. What had once been an experiment, dismissed by her classmates as a silly dream, was slowly transforming into something her community wanted to be part of. At home, her parents noticed the change too. Her mother no longer needed convincing to let her use the kitchen for late-night baking. Her father brought home extra ingredients when he stopped by the store, slipping them onto the counter without a word. Her brother, proud and eager, boasted to his friends about helping with photos for the website. Their quiet acts of support filled the house with a sense of shared purpose. It wasn't just her project anymore. It was something they believed in too. Word of mouth carried further than Maya expected. A neighbor she barely knew knocked on their door one evening, holding a basket of hand-woven pot holders. "I heard you're helping people sell what they make," she said. "Do you think these might fit?" Maya accepted them gratefully, photographing them that night and adding them to the site. Soon after, a retired man from down the street stopped by her table, offering to carve small wooden toys for her to sell. "Keeps me busy," he said with a shrug, but the glimmer of pride in his eyes told Maya it meant much more. Her peers outside of class began noticing as well. Students from other grades who had seen her stall or heard from friends approached her between classes, asking questions about her cookies or her site. One girl even asked if Maya could design a page for her mother's handmade jewelry. It was subtle at first, but the whispers that once mocked her began to shift. The same hallways that had once echoed with laughter at her expense now carried different murmurs, curious ones, admiring ones. The biggest surprise came one evening when Maya checked her email and found a message from a stranger in a nearby town. They had stumbled across her site through a friend's recommendation and wanted to order several items. The order wasn't large, but it was the first from someone she had never met, someone entirely outside her circle. She stared at the screen for a long moment, then let out a laugh so sudden her brother ran in from the other room to see what had happened. Each step was small, each gain fragile, but together they painted a picture Maya could no longer ignore. What had begun as sketches in her notebook was becoming real, piece by piece. The community that once seemed indifferent now leaned toward her, offering support in ways big and small. For the first time, she felt that the dream she had carried so quietly was no longer hers alone. That night, she packed away the empty boxers and counted the day's earnings. Maya sat on her bed and looked at the stack of names in her notebook. Her tired hands ached, her eyes burned from exhaustion, but she smiled. The whispers of ridicule were being replaced by voices that wanted her to succeed. Her idea was proving itself not with loud triumphs, but with steady, undeniable proof that it mattered. She whispered the words to herself before turning off the light. A quiet promise she finally believed. This is working. The email came on a Wednesday afternoon, tucked between spam messages and school reminders. Maya almost deleted it without opening, assuming it was another advertisement. But the subject line caught her eye. Interested in placing a bulk order? She clicked, her heart skipping. Read the words twice to be sure she wasn't imagining them. The message was from a small cafe on the other side of town. The owner had tasted her cookies at the market someone had brought them in and wanted to know if she could provide a steady supply for their shelves. They weren't asking for a dozen or even 2. They wanted 50 bags a week to start, with the possibility of more if sales went well. Maya's breath caught in her throat. She stared at the screen, her fingers hovering above the keyboard. Too stunned to reply, she closed her eyes for a moment, trying to take it in. For months, she had worked in silence, testing recipes, printing labels on the family's old printer, photographing neighbors' crafts for her site, and fighting against the echo of her teacher's mocking voice. Every small success felt fragile, as if it might crumble under the weight of her own doubt. But this was different. This was real. Someone outside her circle believed in her work enough to pay for it consistently. It wasn't just a purchase, it was trust. She rushed into the kitchen, laptop clutched in her arms. Her mother was chopping vegetables for dinner, her father reading at the table, her brother sprawled on the floor with his homework. They want. In order, she blurted, the words tumbling out in a breathless rush. A cafe they want me to supply them, every week. 50 bags? Her mother froze, knife hovering above the cutting board. 50, she repeated, turning slowly. Her father lowered his newspaper, eyes widening. Her brother sat up straight, grinning. That's amazing, her father said, standing to look over her shoulder at the screen. See all that work? Is paying off. Her mother's practical side surfaced immediately. Do you have enough ingredients for that many? Enough bags? Labels? Maya shook her head, still overwhelmed. Not yet, but I can figure it out. That evening turned into a planning session. They spread papers across the table, calculating costs and supplies. Her father offered to drive her to a wholesale store to buy flour, sugar, and chocolate chips. In bulk, her mother suggested reorganizing the kitchen so Maya could bake efficiently. Even her brother volunteered to help seal bags and stick labels. The air buzzed with energy. The entire family, caught up in her momentum the following days, were a blur. Maya spent every free moment preparing, testing recipes to ensure consistency. The kitchen became a whirlwind of measuring cups, mixing bowls, and the sweet smell of baking. Late into the night, trays of cookies cooled on racks, while labels printed from the wheezing old machine. She worked with her hair tied back, flour dusting her clothes, her hands aching from repetition. But she refused to stop. When she delivered the first batch to the cafe, her nerves nearly unraveled her. She packed the bags neatly in cardboard, boxers, and rode with her father to the other side of town. The cafe was small but cozy, filled with the hum of quiet conversations and the scent of fresh coffee. The owner, a woman with kind eyes and a businesslike tone, greeted Maya warmly. "These look wonderful," she said, opening a box and lifting a bag. "I think our customers will love them." She handed Maya an envelope with payment, and the weight of it in Maya's hand felt heavier than its contents. It was proof that her dream had stepped out of her notebook and into the world as she left the cafe. The bell above the door jingling behind her, Maya felt a rush of pride unlike anything she had known. This was no longer a side project hidden in the quiet corners of her room. This was business. This was growth. And though it was only one cafe, only one order, it was enough to silence the doubts that had haunted her since that humiliating day. In class, that night, when the house had grown still, Maya sat at her desk and opened her notebook. She flipped past pages filled with sketches and failures until she found an empty sheet. At the top, in bold letters, she wrote, "First client secured." Underneath, she added the date. Then she let her pencil hover, considering what to write next. She smiled, the kind of smile that came from deep inside, and wrote, "This is only the beginning." For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine what came after. More cafes. More products. More people finding value in what she created. The thought didn't scare her anymore. It lit her up. She closed the notebook carefully, as if preserving the weight of that single milestone, and whispered to herself, "I knew it would matter." The sound of her own voice in the quiet room felt steady, certain. It wasn't a dream anymore, it was real. Maya quickly discovered that success carried its own demands. The cafe's weekly order became a turning point, but it also introduced her to a new kind of pressure. For the first time, people depended on her consistency. 50 bags of cookies every week wasn't just a number, it meant waking up earlier, staying up later, and managing her time with precision she had never practiced before. School assignments, once her only responsibility, now had to share space with measuring flour, scheduling deliveries, and keeping records of every expense and payment. She started carrying a planner, small spiral-bound notebook that became her constant companion, each page filled with lists, shopping schedules, order deadlines, tasks to finish before classes, and reminders to answer emails. Where she had once relied on bursts of inspiration and late-night sprints of effort, now she needed rhythm. She learned quickly that skipping a step meant chaos later. If she didn't order enough supplies in advance, she risked missing deadlines. If she procrastinated on homework, her grades slipped, adding more stress. Slowly, through trial and error, she found balance. Money, too, became a teacher. The first payments from the cafe had felt thrilling, more money than she had ever held at once. But the thrill faded when she realized how quickly it disappeared into expenses. Flour, sugar, butter, bags, printer, ink, every purchase chipped away at her profits. At first, she forgot to set aside enough to replace supplies, leaving her scrambling when her pantry ran empty. She learned the hard way that excitement over sales meant little if she didn't budget carefully. Her father sat with her one evening, showing her how to divide earnings into categories: supplies, savings, and reinvestment. She took notes diligently, creating a simple ledger where she tracked every dollar in and out. What once felt overwhelming slowly became routine. With these new responsibilities came a shift inside her. Maya began to see herself differently. She was no longer the girl who trembled at the front of a classroom, waiting for approval that never came. She was someone who could plan, deliver, and manage. Even the small frustrations, the printer breaking mid-run, a batch of cookies burning because she lost track of time, no longer crushed her. Instead, she adapted. She started baking extra trays to account for mistakes, saving printed labels in advance, keeping backup supplies on hand. Each failure became a lesson folded into the process. Leadership crept into her life in ways she hadn't expected. Her brother, once just a helper, now looked to her for instructions. He asked what tasks needed doing, what photos she wanted him to take, when deliveries should be packed. Even her mother, who managed the household with practiced ease, followed Maya's lead when it came to the business. At the market, neighbors who once dismissed her now asked for advice. She guided them on pricing, packaging, and how to present their crafts online. Each time she explained patiently, she heard herself sounding older, steadier, more certain. The confidence she carried into those interactions bled into her presence at school. Though she didn't flaunt her progress, something about her had changed. She no longer avoided eye contact in the halls, or shrank when classmates whispered. When teachers asked questions in class, she answered clearly, her voice no longer trembling. She had learned how to stand in uncomfortable moments without breaking. That resilience made everything else seem smaller in comparison. Sometimes she thought back to the day she had stood in front of her classmates, notebook shaking in her hands as laughter filled the room. That memory had once haunted her, but now it felt like a different lifetime. The timid girl from that day still lived somewhere inside her, but she was no longer in control. The Maya who had emerged through failures and long nights was sharper, tougher, and far less concerned with mockery. She no longer needed validation from those who had dismissed her. Her validation came from the orders she delivered, the money she managed responsibly, the people who trusted her with their business. Late one night, as she closed her ledger and stacked her notebooks neatly on her desk, Maya caught sight of her reflection in the dark window. Her face was tired, smudged with flour, her hair pulled back loosely. But her eyes were steady, and there was something in her expression she had never noticed before. It wasn't pride exactly, it was a quiet certainty, a calm knowledge of who she was becoming. She whispered it to herself, as if testing the words, "I can do this." She meant it. And unlike before, when such statements had felt like hope, this time it felt like truth. 2 years passed in a way that felt both slow and sudden. The long nights of scribbled notes and burned cookies blurred into one another, but the results of those nights built themselves brick by brick into something undeniable. The shy teenager who once stood trembling at the front of her classroom was no longer the same girl. Maya had grown into her work, and her work had grown with her. Little websites she had once coded with shaky hands now gleamed with polish. She had saved enough to hire a designer who helped refine its look, smoothing out the rough edges she had left behind. Dozens of local makers now listed their products, their scarves, wooden toys, ceramics, handmade soaps. Orders arrived not just from her town, but from neighboring cities, sometimes even further. What had started as a side experiment had become a recognized hub, a place where people trusted they would find something real and meaningful. The cafe that had given her the first steady order still stocked her cookies, but now they were packaged with printed labels, complete with her logo, ingredients, and contact details. She had expanded to a second cafe, then a small grocery store that wanted to feature local goods. She never forgot the panic of her first bulk order. But now she managed them with practiced confidence, setting schedules, delegating tasks to helpers, and planning months ahead. Her life looked different in small, everyday ways, too. The once-worn laptop had been replaced by a newer one she'd purchased with her own earnings. The printer that used to jam constantly was replaced by a sturdier model. She even rented a small shared kitchen for baking, no longer overwhelming her. Families stove at all hours. Her parents still supported her. Her brother still helped with photography and packaging. But Maya now ran the business as its leader, not as a girl fumbling in the dark. With success came recognition. Articles appeared in local newspapers calling her a young entrepreneur to watch. Community groups invited her to share her journey, and she often spoke quietly about her beginnings, never forgetting the sting of that classroom laughter. She didn't share it to dwell on pain, but to remind others that dreams often look foolish before they become real. The invitation arrived one morning in an envelope, embossed with the crest of her old school. She turned it over in her hands, her stomach tightening with a strange mix of emotions. Inside was a letter from the administration. They were hosting a student business fair and wanted her to return as a guest speaker. For a moment, she sat frozen. At her desk, staring at the words, she thought of the girl she had been the last time she stood in that building, her idea ridiculed and dismissed. And now, 2 years later, they wanted her back to speak. Her first instinct was to refuse. She had no need to revisit that past, no desire to walk the same halls that had once swallowed her confidence. But as she folded the letter and placed it on her desk, she felt a steady resolve rise within her. This wasn't about old wounds anymore. It was about showing the students who came after her that one person's laughter did not define their worth. It was about closing a circle. When the day arrived, Maya dressed with care. She chose a simple blazer, her hair tied neatly, her expression calm. Walking into the school again felt surreal. The lockers, the scuffed floors, the smell of pencil shavings and paper, all of it, rushed back with memories. Students hurried through the halls, some glancing curiously at her without knowing who she was. She held her head high, not to show off, But because she no longer knew how to walk any other way, the auditorium was filled with students and staff, their chatter echoing off the walls. At the front row, she spotted familiar faces, older now but unmistakable teachers she had once feared, and among them, the very one who had mocked her dream. He looked older too, grayer at the temples, but his expression froze when their eyes met. She gave a small, polite nod before turning toward the stage. As her name was announced, the applause rose. She stepped up to the podium, her notes in hand, but her heart steady. For 2 years, she had built something from nothing, and now she stood, not as a student desperate for approval, but as a young woman certain of her path. The microphone caught her first words, and she let them fall with quiet confidence. 2 years ago, I stood in a classroom in this very school, sharing an idea that most people thought was impossible. Today, I want to tell you what happened next. The hush that fell over the room carried with it the weight of everything she had endured. This was not the timid girl of before. This was Maya, older, stronger, and ready to speak her truth. The morning of the event broke clear and bright, sunlight spilling across her desk as Maya gathered her things. The letter from the school lay folded neatly in her bag, though she hardly needed the reminder. The thought of returning had lived in her chest for weeks, heavy and insistent.
Now that the day had arrived,
Her body buzzed with a nervous energy she hadn't felt in a long time. She smoothed her blazer with steady hands, adjusted the papers she had written and rewritten a dozen times, and told herself that she was ready. The drive to the school passed in a blur. She sat in the back seat of her father's car, her eyes fixed on the horizon as houses and trees slipped past. She had not set foot on campus since the day she graduated. And even then she had left quickly, eager to put the memory of humiliation behind her. Yet as the school building came into view, its familiar brick walls and wide windows bathed in morning light, the old knot in her stomach returned. She stepped out of the car and stood still for a moment, breathing deeply. The air smelled the same freshly cut grass, faintly of chalk and paper. Students bustled at the entrance, some laughing, some hurrying with backpacks bouncing against their shoulders. No one looked at her twice. They didn't know her as the girl who once trembled. Before a classroom, they saw only a young woman in a blazer carrying herself with quiet confidence. Still, as she pushed open the doors and entered the hallway, memories surged like shadows rushing to meet her. She saw herself at 16, clutching her notebook, her voice wavering as she spoke of her dream. She heard the burst of laughter, the mocking questions, the whispers that chased her into the corridor. The echoes were so sharp it felt as though the past had been etched into the very tiles of the floor. Her heels clicked softly as she walked past the lockers, the same dented metal doors lined in rows. Students leaned against them, chatting and scrolling through their phones. She caught fragments of conversation, the rhythms so similar to the voices she once dreaded. But this time, she didn't bow her head. She walked tall, her shoulders squared, her gaze steady. The shame that had once bent her seemed almost foreign now. Like a story that belonged to someone else, she reached the classroom where it had all begun. The door was open, and she paused in the threshold, glancing inside. Rows of desks, neat and ordered, sunlight streaming across the whiteboard. Different faces filled the seats, but for a moment she could almost see her old classmates, their whispering and laughing as her teacher mocked her idea. She felt the ghost of the humiliation tighten in her chest, and then slowly she exhaled, letting it go. That room no longer held her prisoner. It was just a room filled with students who had no idea what had happened years before. As she continued down the hall, teachers passed by, nodding politely. A few recognized her and greeted her warmly, their surprise hidden behind professional smiles. One even said, "We're proud to have you back," words she would have never imagined hearing 2 years ago. Each acknowledgement chipped away at the unease, replacing it with a quiet sense of victory. She wasn't here as the student desperate for approval. She was here as someone who had carved her own path. With or without it, near the auditorium, she paused again, catching her reflection in the glass case that displayed trophies and plaques. The face staring back was older, steadier, framed by hair pinned neatly in place. Her eyes looked sharper than they had in that long-ago reflection she remembered from the locker door, when tears had blurred her vision.
Ow.
She studied herself for a long moment, realizing how far she had come not just in business, but in spirit. The sound of students filing into the auditorium reached her ears, the low rumble of voices rising and falling. She adjusted the papers in her hand but knew she didn't really need them. The story she was about to tell was written into her bones, etched in the nights she had spent working, in the failures she had turned into lessons, the victories she had earned one step at a time. As she stood outside the doors, waiting for her turn to be introduced, Maya felt both the weight of her past and the strength of her present pressing against her. The laughter she once endured would always be part of her memory, but it no longer held power over her. Walking those halls again had shown her the truth. She wasn't the girl who had been mocked. She was the woman who had returned unshaken, with proof that dreams could survive ridicule. And with that realization, she stepped forward, ready to face the room where her voice would no longer tremble. When Maya stepped onto the stage, the lights caught her first, casting her in a soft glow that made the auditorium hush. The principal introduced her with enthusiasm, her name spoken with respect that would have felt impossible 2 years earlier. Applause followed, rising from students who didn't yet know her story, only that she was someone worth listening to. As she glanced across the audience, her gaze moved from one curious face to another until it landed on him. There, in the second row among the faculty, sat Mr. Parker. His posture was stiff, his eyes locked on her with a look that was neither warm nor dismissive, just startled. He hadn't expected to see her, not like this. In his memory, she was still the timid girl, clutching her notebook, her voice trembling as he picked apart her dream in front of the class. He had laughed then, certain he was teaching her a lesson about realism, yet now confronted by the reality of her standing at the podium as a guest speaker, he looked as though the ground beneath him had shifted. For a moment, Maya felt the old sting of that day, the echo of the laughter he had stirred in the classroom. She remembered the flush of shame that had burned her cheeks, the desperate wish to disappear into her seat. But as she stood before him now, the memory did not weigh her down. Instead, it steadied her, reminding her of how far she had come since the day he tried to shrink her into silence. She took a breath, her voice strong as she began her speech. She spoke about beginnings, about the uncertainty of trying something new when no one believed in it. She talked about the small steps, the late nights, the failures, the long process of learning to budget and plan. The hours spent practicing skills no one thought she could master. She described the spark that grew when customers began to notice her work, how the community started to support her, and how that first steady order changed everything. The words flowed not as a performance but as truth, each sentence rooted in experience. All the while, she was aware of Mr. Parker. He sat with his arms crossed at first, his jaw tight, but as she continued, something shifted in his expression. The stern line of his mouth softened, his brows furrowed, as if memory weighed on him. He was remembering the way he had dismissed her idea with mocking questions, how the class had laughed at his prompting, how she had stood there, silent and wounded. The scene replayed in his mind, but now he was forced to confront it against the backdrop of who she had become by the time she spoke of resilience, of how rejection can become fuel rather than failure. She no longer needed to glance his way to know what he was feeling. She could sense the discomfort radiating from him. It wasn't the discomfort of disapproval, but of regret. When the applause erupted at the end of her talk, the students on their feet, Maya stood tall, her chest rising with a breath that felt like release. She looked down again at Mr. Parker. He was clapping too, though slower than the rest, his eyes never leaving her face. His expression was unreadable, part admiration, part something heavier. Perhaps he was realizing that the words he had spoken so easily years ago had not crushed her after all. Perhaps he was realizing they had only made her stronger, though at a cost she should never have had to pay. After the event, when the students spilled out of the auditorium buzzing with excitement, Maya remained near the stage, speaking with a few curious teachers and organizers. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw him approach, He walked with hesitation, his steps measured, his face drawn with an expression she had never seen on him before. He wasn't the confident authority figure she remembered from her teenage years. He looked smaller somehow, uncertain. "Maya," he said at last, his voice quieter than she ever remembered it. I didn't expect this." She turned to him fully, her gaze calm. "Most people didn't," she replied simply. There was a pause, a silence heavy with things unsaid. His eyes searched hers as if he wanted to explain, to justify his past actions, but the words didn't come easily. Finally, he let out a breath and said, "I may not have been kind back then. I thought I was teaching you something, but—" He trailed off, shaking his head. "I see now that I was wrong." Maya didn't answer right away. She studied him, not with anger, but with clarity. She didn't need his apology to validate her journey. She had already proven herself through every late night and every success that followed. Yet hearing him admit it, even haltingly, carried its own weight. "Maybe you were teaching me," she said at last, "but not in the way you thought." His lips parted as if to respond, but he stayed silent, nodding slightly instead. And in that moment, the balance shifted. The authority he once held over her was gone. She was no longer his student. She was his equal, if not something more. The auditorium had quieted into a stillness that felt almost sacred. The rustle of papers, the shifting of seats, the whispers of conversation all faded until there was nothing but the soft hum of the microphone in front of Maya. She stood at the podium with the eyes of the entire school upon her. For a moment, she let the silence stretch. It gave her the space to breathe, to center herself, and to remember why she was here. "I want to tell you something I've never forgotten," she began, her voice steady but low, carrying across the room. With ease, 2 years ago I stood in one of these classrooms with an idea I believed in. It wasn't polished, it wasn't big, but it mattered to me. She paused, her gaze moving slowly over the rows of students leaning forward in their seats. "When I shared it, I was laughed at." The words landed like stones thrown into a still pond. A ripple of shock passed through the room. Students glanced at one another, brows raised, as if trying to imagine what that moment must have been like. Some whispered quietly, though the sound quickly faded as Maya continued. "My classmates laughed. My teacher mocked me. I can still hear the words he used, telling me I was naive, telling me I didn't understand reality, that what I wanted to do was impossible." She didn't glance toward Mr. Parker, though she felt the weight of his presence. She didn't need to. Her words weren't for him, they were for the students who might one day stand where she once had. She lifted her notebook from the podium. The same one she had carried back then, though now its edges were worn and its pages swollen with years of use. She held it up so the audience could see. "This is the notebook I carried that day. I walked out of class, clutching it like a shield, humiliated, embarrassed, ready to throw it all away. But I didn't. I went home and filled it with new ideas. I poured every failure, every plan, every dream into these pages." There was a murmur from the crowd, but it wasn't the sound of dismissal. It was awe, the kind that comes when people realize they are being shown something raw and honest. Maya's voice strengthened. "I won't pretend it didn't hurt," she said, her tone firm. "It did. It hurt to be laughed at. It hurt to be called foolish. But that pain became fuel. Every doubt, every cruel whisper, every time I was told I would never succeed, it all became part of the reason I kept going." She described the nights at her desk, the long hours of failed attempts, coins she counted after market days when no one seemed interested, the exhaustion of trying to balance schoolwork with her business. She told them about the first stranger who bought something because they believed in it, the cafe that gave her the first order, and how slowly, piece by piece, her dream grew into something tangible. "I'm not here to tell you it was easy," she said, her eyes sweeping across the students who now sat utterly silent. "I'm here to tell you that even when it's hard, even when people mock you, dismiss you, or tell you your ideas are too small-lit, doesn't mean you should stop. Sometimes the very things people laugh at are the ones that matter most." Her voice softened then, but the conviction in it was stronger than ever. "I was once the girl you could laugh at. Today, I am the girl standing here to remind you that your dreams don't need anyone else's approval to be real. The room seemed to hold its breath. Even the teachers in the front row sat motionless, caught in the power of her words. Maya let the silence settle again, knowing the weight of what she had shared needed space to sink in. She placed her notebook gently on the podium, her hand lingering on it as if to honor everything it had carried for her. When she finally stepped back, the applause erupted. It wasn't hesitant or polite. It was thunderous, echoing against the walls and rising like a wave. Students stood, clapping with wide eyes and flushed cheeks, many of them whispering to each other in voices laced with admiration. This wasn't just a speech, it was a revelation. Maya stood in that moment, her chest rising with a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, and felt the past and present meet. The laughter that had once crushed her now existed only as a stepping stone beneath her feet. She faced the past head-on, and instead of breaking her, it had given her the strength to stand taller than she ever imagined. The applause had finally faded, but the atmosphere in the auditorium lingered with something heavier, something alive. The students didn't return to their usual shifting, yawning, or staring absently at the clock. Instead, they leaned toward one another, whispering in tones that held none of the sharpness Maya remembered from her own time in those seats. The whispers carried surprise, admiration, and a kind of restless curiosity, as though each student was privately measuring their own ideas against her story. From the podium, Maya could see the ripple of their faces more clearly now. A girl in the front row, no older than 16, had her notebook open on her lap, her pen moving quickly. She wasn't jotting down homework or doodling to pass the time. She was writing down the words Maya had just spoken. Behind her, a boy who had spent most of the introduction slouched low in his chair, now sat upright. His expression serious, eyes locked on Maya, as if seeing possibility for the first time. The room buzzed with quiet energy. A few students exchanged wide-eyed looks that seemed to say, if she could do it, maybe I can too. Maya noticed one student toward the back whispering rapidly to his neighbor, tapping his pencil against his notebook as though an idea had just ignited in his mind. Another student lifted her phone discreetly, not to scroll through social media, as was often the habit, but to type quickly, as if capturing inspiration before it slipped away. She had once been the girl in these seats, head bent, heart racing under the weight of ridicule. Now she stood watching students absorb her story, not with cruelty, but with intent. Their faces alight with recognition that dreams weren't foolish if someone was willing to work for them. The shift was subtle, but undeniable. She could see it in the way their shoulders leaned closer to one another, in the furrow of brows, not from boredom, but thought. They weren't laughing. They were listening even after she had finished speaking. When the floor opened for questions, hands rose cautiously at first, then more eagerly. A boy near the middle row asked how she handled failure when it seemed easier to quit. Maya smiled, gently, remembering the nights of burnt cookies and empty sales. You don't stop, she answered simply. You write down what went wrong, and you try again. Failure teaches you things success never could. The boy nodded, scribbling her response word for word as though he already knew he would return. To it later, another student asked how she balanced school with her business. She admitted it had been hard, that she had fallen asleep over textbooks, that she had almost broken under the weight of exhaustion. But then she explained how she learned. Discipline. How her planner became her best ally. How sacrifice sometimes meant choosing growth over comfort. The girl who asked beamed, her shoulders straightening with a confidence Maya recognized in herself. Even those who didn't speak seemed changed. Some whispered to each other about ideas they had never dared to voice, sharing them with the tentative excitement of secrets. One boy at the edge of the row leaned back, arms crossed, pretending disinterest. But Maya caught the faint curve of a smile tugging at his lips as he tapped his sneaker against the floor, restless with thought. It was in their eyes that she saw the greatest shift. Where she had once seen mockery, now she saw a possibility. Where there had once been laughter, now there was quiet determination. They weren't just listening to her story, they were placing themselves inside it, mapping their own struggles. Against the arc of her journey, Maya closed her notebook and let the silence return once more. She looked over the rows of students and felt a swell of something she hadn't expected. She had come here to face her past, to show herself she was no longer the timid girl who had once been laughed at. But in their reactions, in their notes, their whispers, their eager questions, she realized this moment wasn't just about her redemption. It was about them. She could see the seeds of new dreams forming before her eyes. Some would fade, she knew, but others might take root just as hers had. And maybe, years from now, one of these students would stand on a stage just like she was now, telling their story of how it all began. For the first time, Maya understood that her journey had grown beyond herself. It had become a mirror for others, reflecting not just what she had achieved, but what they might one day achieve too. As the students filled the auditorium with applause and scattered conversations, Maya kept her gaze steady, though her eyes inevitably returned to the second row. There he was, Mr. Parker, the man whose voice had once cracked through her like a whip, whose laughter had stirred an entire classroom into ridicule. He sat rigidly, his face flushed, his hands folded tightly in his lap as though clapping had been a duty rather than a choice, like the students around him, whose eyes shone with excitement and admiration. His expression carried something else entirely. His discomfort, Maya could see it in the way his jaw tightened whenever she spoke. She had watched his arms cross at the start, a barrier he had put up to remind himself of his role as authority. But as her story unfolded, as her words threaded together failure, persistence, and triumph, his defenses faltered. Now he sat red-faced, eyes fixed on her with an intensity that wasn't admiration but an acknowledgement he could not voice. It was strange, almost surreal, to see him like this. In her memories, he was always larger than life, looming confident, unshakable. In that classroom, his mocking smile had felt like law, his words final verdicts that left no room for defiance. Yet here, under the bright lights of the auditorium, the balance had shifted. She stood at the podium, commanding the attention of the entire school. While he sat in silence among the crowd, unable to reclaim the authority he once wielded so easily, the students had noticed too. She caught a few glances in his direction. Students whispering quietly to each other, curious about his reaction. They knew who he was. Many of them had likely heard stories of how sharp his criticism could be. Some of them might have experienced it firsthand. But here, in this moment, he wasn't the voice of power. He was part of the audience, subject to the weight of her story like everyone else. Maya didn't need to call him out. She didn't need to speak his name. The silence that pressed around him was louder than anything she could have said. His presence in the room was already an answer, already a testament to the shift in power. She could see him struggling with it, his lips parting once as if to speak, then closing again when no words came. His face reddened further when the principal leaned over to whisper something to him, perhaps a compliment about her speech. Perhaps a reminder of the irony that the girl he once dismissed was now celebrated on this stage. As the students began asking questions, Maya noticed he stayed motionless, not raising a hand, not interjecting as he once might have. This was a man accustomed to correcting, to asserting authority, yet now he found himself wordless, pressed into silence by the very reality he had once denied. She wondered what thoughts churned behind his fixed expression. Did he regret the way he had spoken to her that day? Did he remember the way she had stood frozen, notebook trembling in her hands, unable to respond? Or did he tell himself even now that his harshness had played a part in shaping her? She would never know for certain. What she did know was how. It felt to see him there, smaller, quieter, diminished not by her words, but by her presence. He had once mocked her idea as unrealistic, a fantasy unworthy of attention. Now he was forced to sit among rows of students scribbling her words into their notebooks, inspired by the very dream he had tried to crush. That truth was louder than any accusation she could have leveled against him. Maya answered the last question from a student and closed her notebook with calm precision. As the principal returned to thank her, the applause thundered again. Let it wash over her, not as vindication, but as proof that the timid girl in that classroom was long gone. She had no need to humiliate him as he had humiliated her. His silence was enough. It was its own admission, its own confession. When the crowd began to disperse, she glanced one final time at him. His face remained red, his hands still clasped. Tightly together, their eyes met briefly. He looked away first. For Maya, that was the clearest sign of all. The power he once held over her was gone. She no longer stood beneath his judgment. She stood beyond it. When the last of the applause faded and the students began to file out of the auditorium in clusters of chatter and wide-eyed excitement, Maya remained at the front, the echo of the moment still humming through her body. The principal stepped forward, his hand extended, his face glowing with pride. "You've given them something they'll never forget," he said warmly. His grip was firm, the kind reserved for equals, not for a former student. The shift in tone did not escape her. This was not the voice of an authority speaking down. It was the voice of respect. Teachers gathered too, some of whom she recognized, others she only vaguely remembered. They offered words she had never heard. During her school days, inspiring, one called her exactly the kind of example they need right now. Another leaned closer, lowering her voice as if sharing a secret. It reminded me why I started teaching in the first place. Each phrase settled over Maya with quiet weight. She had come expecting to prove something to herself. But here she was being told. She had proven something to everyone else. The principal led her out into the hallway where parents were waiting to collect their children. Some had stayed behind after the event, curious about the young woman who had spoken so candidly about failure and perseverance. They approached in pairs and small groups, their expressions open, grateful. One mother reached for Maya's hand, holding it between both of hers. "My daughter came home last week saying she didn't think she was smart enough to follow her dream," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Hearing you today, she needed that more than I can tell you." The father nearby added, "You showed them that success doesn't come from being perfect. It comes from refusing to quit. That's something they can carry." His son, standing beside him, nodded shyly, clutching a notebook filled with hurried notes. Students who hadn't dared raise their hands during the talk now gathered around her, their curiosity spilling over in questions. "How did you keep going when no one believed in you?" one asked. "What was the hardest part?" Another chimed in. A third voice, uncertain but eager, whispered, "Do you think someone my age could start too?" Maya listened, answering each question patiently. She told them about long nights, about the exhaustion, about the ledger she still kept where every dollar was accounted for. She admitted she had thought of quitting more times than she could count, but explained how she reminded herself of why she started. She encouraged them to write their ideas down, to give them shape, because sometimes the act of writing could keep a dream alive when nothing else seemed possible. As the circle around her grew, she noticed the shift in their eyes. They weren't looking at her as a former student who had once sat in those same halls. They were looking at her as someone who had carved a path forward, someone who had walked through fire and come out stronger. They treated her not as a peer, not as a girl fumbling with a notebook, but as a leader. Teachers nearby watched too, nodding quietly to each other. The principal whispered to one of them, but Maya caught the words. "She's exactly the kind of example they'll remember long after today." The phrase role model surfaced more than once in the conversations around her, and each time it made her pause. She had not set out to be one. She had set out simply to survive, to prove that the laughter had not broken her. Yet here she was, her journey mirrored in the eager eyes of students and the grateful smiles of parents. A small boy tugged at her sleeve, no more than 12, his notebook clutched awkwardly in his other hand. "I want to make video games," he said in a rush. "Everyone tells me it's too hard. But you said it's okay to start small. Do you think I could really do it?" Maya knelt, so her eyes were level with his. "Yes," she said softly, with the same certainty she wished someone had given her 2 years ago. "Start small. Start where you are. Don't wait for permission."
Nice.
The boy's eyes widened, and he nodded fiercely, as if he had just been given the key to a locked door. As the crowd eventually began to thin, Maya stood in the quiet hallway, the voices fading into the distance. She could still feel the weight of their questions, their gratitude, their hope. And though she was tired, she felt something even stronger. Recognition that her journey was no longer just her own. She had become part of something larger. A story carried in the whispers of students and the encouragement of parents. She had walked back into the school where she once felt small. And now she walked out having earned their respect. Not demanded, not forced, but earned through persistence. Humility. In the simple act of refusing to let go of her dream. The hallway outside the auditorium had emptied into a hushed quiet, the echoes of student chatter fading as families drifted toward the parking lot. Maya lingered by the stage door, her notes tucked neatly back into her bag, her body still buzzing from the energy of the morning. She had spoken, answered questions, accepted praise, and now she stood in a rare moment of stillness. The polished floor reflected the last streaks of sunlight coming through tall windows. And for the first time all day, she felt her heart beat slow. That was when she noticed him. Mr. Parker. He lingered several feet away, half-shadowed in the doorway, as though caught between leaving and stepping forward. His posture, once so rigid and authoritative, seemed softened now, the weight of hesitation pressing against his frame. He cleared his throat, and the sound pulled her eyes toward him. Their gazes met, and for a heartbeat, she was pulled back. Into the memory of a classroom, his laughter sharp, the class erupting at his lead, her own cheeks burning with humiliation. But then the memory dissolved under the reality before her, a man no longer sure of his place, standing uncertain in front of a former student he once dismissed. "Maya," he began, his voice lower than she remembered. Stripped of the sharpness that had once silenced her, he took a tentative step closer. "That was remarkable. Truly." He paused, his eyes flicking to the floor before meeting hers again. "I'll admit I didn't expect to see you here like this." She let the silence linger, not out of cruelty, but because she didn't feel the need to rush in with reassurance. She watched him shift, his hands tightening around the folder he carried. His face tinged with the same flush she had noticed earlier. "I was hard on you," he said finally. The words came haltingly, as if each one cost him something. "When you presented that idea, I thought I was doing my job, teaching you about reality, about limits. But I see now that I was wrong. I underestimated you. And more than that, I dismissed you when I should have encouraged you." The admission hung in the air, heavy with years of unspoken truth. He looked at her then, not as a teacher addressing a student, but as a man confronting his own mistakes. "I suppose what I'm trying to say," he added, voice unsteady, "is that I'm sorry I didn't see what you were capable of." Maya studied him, her expression calm. The hurt from that day hadn't vanished, but it no longer burned as it once had. She could feel the distance between who she had been and who she was now. And in that distance, she found her answer. "You did hurt me," she said evenly. "That day stayed with me for a long time. I walked out of your class believing my dream was foolish, and it took everything I had not to let that belief become permanent." She let out a quiet breath. "But I also learned something important because of it. I learned that the world will laugh sometimes, even when you're serious. And if you want something badly enough, you have to keep going anyway." He nodded slowly, his shoulders slumping as though her words struck deeper than any reprimand could. She continued, her voice steady but without bitterness. "I don't hate you for it. We're wrong, but in a way, your doubt pushed me further. Not because I wanted to prove you wrong, but because I had to prove to myself that I was right." For a long moment, he said nothing. His eyes searched hers, and then he gave a small, almost weary smile. "You've grown into someone extraordinary, Maya. I wish I had seen it sooner." She returned his smile, soft and measured. "Maybe you couldn't have. Sometimes people can only see what they're ready to see." She shouldered her bag, her tone gentle. "But I appreciate you telling me this now." The tension eased slightly, the silence no longer heavy, but reflective. He straightened his folder under his arm, giving her a respectful nod before stepping back. It was awkward, imperfect, but genuine, and that was enough. As Maya walked away, her heels clicking against the polished floor, she felt no triumph over Him, no lingering anger. What she carried instead was a quiet grace, the understanding that forgiveness was not about erasing the past, but about refusing to be bound by it. And for the first time, she realized she had left that day in the classroom behind her completely. The hallway was quiet except for the distant echo of shoes against tile. The building nearly empty after the event, Maya stood with her bag slung. Over one shoulder, the lingering applause of the audience, still humming faintly in her mind. Across from her, Mr. Parker shifted uncomfortably, gaze dipping and lifting as though searching for the right words but unsure where to place them. He had already stumbled through an apology, the first words of real vulnerability she had. Ever heard from him? Now he waited, uncertain, perhaps fearing that she might finally return the sting he once delivered so casually years ago. For a moment, Maya let the silence settle between them. She thought back to the girl she had been, standing at the front of his classroom, hands trembling as she presented her idea. She remembered the flush of shame, the way her classmates' laughter had followed her into the hallways, and the crushing weight of believing she was foolish. It would have been easy now, standing taller, stronger, and undeniably successful, to turn that humiliation back on him. She could have reminded him of every word he had thrown at her, every sneer and dismissal. She could have enjoyed watching him squirm. But as she looked at him, his posture bent with regret, his tone stripped of authority, she realized that would not give her satisfaction. It would only pull her back into the past, a place she had already outgrown. So she smiled softly, surprising even herself. "Mr. Parker," she said, her voice calm, "I want to thank you." His head jerked slightly, his brow furrowing. "Thank me," he repeated, as though he hadn't heard correctly. "Yes," she said, steady now. "The day you mocked me, it cut deeper than I ever let anyone see. I went home and thought about giving up, but I didn't. Something in me decided that if the world laughed, I would keep going anyway. Your harshness pushed me to find that determination. Without it, maybe I wouldn't have worked as hard as I did. Maybe I wouldn't be standing here today." He blinked, his lips parting slightly, caught between disbelief and a kind of stunned respect. Her words weren't sarcastic or biting. They carried no venom. They were sincere, and that sincerity disarmed him more than anger ever could. "I never expected." He began, then stopped, shaking his head. "I don't deserve that kind of kindness from you." "It's not about what you deserve," Maya replied gently. "It's about what I choose. Carrying bitterness would only keep me chained to that old classroom, to a version of myself who felt powerless. Letting it go and choosing to see the lesson in it, that's how I grew." She shifted her bag higher on her shoulder, her eyes meeting his evenly. "Strength isn't about proving someone wrong. It's about proving yourself right, even when no one else believes in you." The words hung in the air, and she could see the effect on him. Shoulders sank, not with defeat, but with humility, as though a weight had finally been placed where it belonged. His face softened, his usual sharpness replaced by a quiet recognition. He seemed smaller now, not in stature, but in certainty. Realizing that the student he once dismissed now stood far beyond his reach. "I suppose," murmured, voice low. "You've just taught me more in these few minutes than I ever managed to teach you." Maya gave a small, warm smile. Maybe that's the way it was meant to be. They stood in silence a moment longer, not as adversaries, but as two people connected by a past that had shifted into something else. She didn't need to see him punished or humiliated. His regret was real, and her forgiveness was real too. It was not weakness, but the clearest proof of her strength. As she turned to leave, the light from the tall window spilling across the polished floor, Maya felt lighter than she had in years. Choosing kindness hadn't erased the pain of the past, but it had transformed it into something meaningful. It had made her stronger, not in the eyes of others, but in her own. And that was the victory that mattered most. The auditorium was filled with the low hum of voices, the restless energy of students gathering for another school assembly. They leaned against the backs of their seats, whispered in clusters, and checked their phones until the lights dimmed and the stage drew their attention. Standing at the center, Maya adjusted the microphone, her presence calm and assured. It had been 2 years since she had walked these halls as a nervous student with trembling hands and a fragile dream. But now she returned not as someone seeking approval, but as someone offering guidance. Her eyes moved across the faces in front. Of her so many expressions of curiosity, boredom, and expectation. She recognized pieces of her younger self among them. The quiet girl in the third row clutching her notebook, the boy at the back who looked away as if embarrassed to hope for more. She remembered how heavy the weight of ridicule had felt, and how close she had come to letting it crush her. That memory steadied her voice as she began to speak. "I know what it feels like to stand where you are," she told them. "To have an idea that excites you but scares you at the same time. To imagine something bigger for yourself while worrying that no one will understand, or worse, that they'll laugh." The room quieted, the murmurs fading as her words reached them. "I stood right here once and I felt very small. I shared my idea, and instead of support, I heard laughter. That moment could have ended my dream. But instead it lit something in me. And I want you to know it's okay to be doubted. It's okay to be mocked. What matters is what you choose to do next." The students leaned forward, caught not by flashy promises, but by the weight of her sincerity. She told them about late nights spent working while her friends slept, about failed attempts that nearly drained her hope, about the first small successes that reminded her why she started. She spoke not as someone untouchable, but as someone who had stumbled and risen again. At the side of the room, Mr. Parker sat silently. His hands rested in his lap, his posture stiff, but his eyes never left her. He had watched her return once already, had heard her story unfold before the school, but this moment was different. This was not about proving him wrong. It was about proving to others that their worth wasn't defined by the approval of authority. He saw her now as a figure larger than the boundaries of the classroom he once confined her to. She was not simply his former student. She was a mentor, a guide, someone whose words carried the weight of lived truth as she spoke. Students began raising their hands, not with ridicule, but with genuine curiosity. "How do you keep going when you fail?" one asked. Another wanted to know how she had found the courage to continue after being mocked. Maya answered each question with patience, weaving lessons from her own story into encouragement for theirs. She reminded them that dreams did not need permission, that every great idea began with someone daring to be underestimated. When the session ended, a small group of students lingered around her, asking for advice, showing her sketches, notebooks, or half-formed plans. She listened to each one, her presence steady and kind. To them, she wasn't a distant success story. She was someone who had once been exactly where they were and who had chosen not to give up. Mr. Parker remained in his seat, watching quietly. His face revealed no mockery now, only reflection. For years he had measured students by how well they fit into the neat boxes of his lessons, never considering that true potential often lived outside the lines. Seeing Maya surrounded by eager young minds, he realized the legacy she was creating was greater than any single grade lecture or reprimand he had ever given. She had become the kind of teacher he had failed to be, the kind who taught not from authority but from experience, humility, and resilience. As the crowd slowly dispersed, Maya gathered her notes and stood at the edge of the stage. She caught sight of him, gave a small nod of acknowledgement, and turned back to the students, who still lingered by her side. There was no bitterness in her glance, only a quiet recognition that life had brought her full circle. The girl who once trembled at the front of the room was gone. In her place stood a woman who carried the scars of mockery and failure, but wore them as proof of strength. Her legacy was no longer about the laughter that once haunted her, but about the inspiration she now planted in others. And as her teacher, sat in silence. He understood that sometimes the greatest lessons come not from those who stand at the front of the class, but from those who rise above it.